Nearly 3 years after Pearl Harbor, the balance of the Pacific War had completely changed. The Americans, once on the defensive, had shifted to the offensive, applying their island-hopping strategy to move step by step closer to the Japanese homeland. The landing on Saipan in the Mariana Islands was the decisive point. If Saipan fell, Japan would lose its shield, and its major cities would, for the first time, lie within the strategic bombing range of the B-29. Faced with this danger, the Japanese Imperial General Staff was forced to gamble the entire remainder of its fleet. Admiral Toyoda Somu launched Operation Eigo, hoping to turn the tide with a decisive fleet engagement in the spirit of Kantai Kessen. Vice Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo committed 9 aircraft carriers with about 500 aircraft, supported by 5 battleships, 13 cruisers, and more than 30 destroyers, along with nearly 300 planes from nearby island bases, in the hope of breaking the American advance. Opposing them was the U.S. Fifth Fleet under Admiral Raymond Spruance, with Task Force 58 commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. The Americans deployed 15 aircraft carriers with nearly 900 aircraft, protected by 7 fast battleships, 21 cruisers, and nearly 60 destroyers. With such a powerful force, the United States entered the battle with overwhelming superiority. Both sides understood clearly. The coming naval battle would not only decide the fate of the Marianas, but also determine the course of the entire Pacific War. And in just 2 short days, the ocean would witness the largest carrier battle in history, an event remembered by later generations with a chilling name: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Dawn of June 19, 1944. On the flagship Taihō, Vice Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo scanned the horizon, certain that the American fleet was hidden somewhere to the east. At 4:45 a.m., he ordered the first reconnaissance planes to take off. The Americans launched their own scouts almost simultaneously. By 5:50 a.m., a Japanese Zero had sighted the U.S. fleet. The pilot quickly transmitted the coordinates, then dove in to attack a destroyer, only to be shot down by a wall of anti-aircraft fire. It was the opening shot of the battle. Alerted, Japanese squadrons stationed on Guam rushed to prepare for launch, but American radar had already picked them up. Alarms rang out across the carriers. From the deck of USS Belleau Wood, a flight of F-6F Hellcats roared into the sky to intercept. At Orote Airfield, Japanese planes were still lifting off when the Hellcats struck. The clash was brief and brutal. In less than an hour, 35 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, while the Americans lost only 1 Hellcat. The survivors were forced to abandon their mission and retreat. With the threat from Guam eliminated, the U.S. could now focus on Ozawa's main force. On the flagship USS Lexington, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher calmly monitored the radar. At 8:30 a.m., the screens lit up with hundreds of contacts approaching from the west. Ozawa's strike groups were on their way. 3 separate waves had been launched: 69 aircraft from Force C, 128 from Force A, and 47 from Force B. In less than an hour, Japan had dispatched a total of 244 aircraft toward the American fleet. By 10 a.m., U.S. radar picked up the first wave at a distance of 240 kilometers. Mitcher immediately ordered every Hellcat into the air and recalled patrols from near Guam. In the Japanese formation, pilot Masatoshi Nakagawa led a group of dive bombers searching for the enemy carriers. When the force was about 100 kilometers from its target, impatience led them to pause and regroup, a fatal error. At 10:36 a.m., American Hellcats pounced from above. The sky erupted. Within minutes, 25 Japanese planes were shot down at the cost of 1 Hellcat. Another 16 soon followed. Many of the remaining aircraft jettisoned their bombs in desperation to escape. A handful that broke through were met by the full weight of U.S. naval anti-aircraft fire. Hundreds of 5-inch and 40-millimeter guns opened up, proximity-fused shells filling the air with deadly fragments. One bomb slammed into the deck of the battleship USS South Dakota, shaking the vessel violently and killing or wounding more than 50 sailors. Yet her heavy armor prevented disaster. Fires were quickly contained, and she remained in formation. Not a single Japanese plane reached the American carriers. By the end of the first wave of the 69 Japanese aircraft involved, 42 had been destroyed, and only 27 made it back to their carriers. The sky fell briefly quiet, but everyone knew this was only the opening phase of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. On the carrier Shōkaku, Japanese crews hurriedly prepared for another strike. Ozawa, still confident, decided to commit the remainder of his main force. At 9 a.m., he ordered the launch of a second strike, this time with 129 aircraft. Near midday at 11:07, U.S. radar once again lit up, detecting a large mass of planes approaching from the southwest. The American pilots were already waiting. At a distance of 60 miles, 97 kilometers offshore, before they could even sight the enemy fleet, the Japanese formation was met by Hellcats diving in with ferocious attacks. Within minutes, about 70 Japanese planes were shot down before they ever reached the U.S. ships. A small number broke through and split into groups to carry out scattered attacks. 6 dive bombers plunged toward Rear Admiral Alfred Montgomery's carriers, dropping bombs near USS Wasp and USS Bunker Hill, starting fires and causing several casualties. Fortunately for the Americans, the bombs landed close but not directly on target, so the damage was minor. Another group of Nakajima B-6N torpedo bombers launched against USS Enterprise, the prime target Japan had long hoped to sink. But every torpedo missed. 3 more torpedo bombers attempted to strike USS Princeton, only to be blown apart by anti-aircraft fire as soon as they appeared. By the end of the second wave, the Japanese had suffered catastrophic losses. 97 of the 129 aircraft never returned. At noon, the sun beat down on the Philippine Sea, its light glinting off slicks of oil on the water. Yet the Japanese persisted. At 1 p.m., Ozawa launched a third strike from the north with 47 planes, hoping to hit the U.S. flank. But 80 kilometers from the fleet, they ran into 40 Hellcats. Taken by surprise, the formation scattered and quickly collapsed. Only 7 aircraft were shot down, far fewer than in the earlier waves. But the survivors abandoned their mission, dumping bombs into the sea before retreating. 40 planes managed to return safely, a rare stroke of luck for Ozawa that day. Still unwilling to concede, Ozawa committed his last reserves. Between 11 a.m. and 11:30 a.m., the carriers launched a fourth and final strike with 84 aircraft. Fate, however, intervened. Faulty intelligence had given the Japanese pilots the wrong coordinates for the American fleet. They searched fruitlessly as their fuel dwindled. Unable to return without completing the mission, commanders ordered the formation to split. One group to Guam, the other to Rota for refueling. The withdrawal was anything but safe. The group heading for Rota blundered into Rear Admiral Montgomery's task force. American Hellcats rose to intercept. In the brief clash, 18 Japanese planes were engaged. Only half escaped, while 9 were shot down. At the same time, 9 Japanese dive bombers made a desperate attempt on Wasp and Bunker Hill. Their bombs splashed close alongside, sending water high onto the decks, but caused no real damage. American anti-aircraft fire destroyed 8 of them. Only 1 got away. At Guam, the situation was even worse. As the remaining Japanese aircraft landed to refuel, 27 Hellcats from U.S. carriers swept in. With no time to take off and fight back, the Japanese planes were slaughtered on approach and over the airfield. In just minutes, 30 more aircraft were destroyed, and many of the survivors were so badly damaged they could no longer fight. By the afternoon of June 19, 1944, the smoke of battle had begun to clear, revealing devastation across the Philippine Sea. In just a single day of combat, Japan had suffered unprecedented losses. About 330 aircraft destroyed, including most of the land-based planes from the Marianas and nearly half of the carrier air groups under Ozawa. In contrast, the Americans lost only 23 planes, with their fleet virtually untouched aside from some casualties aboard the battleship South Dakota and minor damage to a few other ships. Watching Japanese aircraft fall in droves, one U.S. pilot remarked, "It's like an old turkey shoot." From that moment, the battle acquired its infamous nickname, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In one day, the elite of Japan's naval air power was nearly wiped out. Yet the disaster for Japan was far from over. As night fell, towering flames still burned on the horizon, the dying pyres of two Japanese carriers. While fierce air battles raged above, U.S. submarines had silently struck below. Early that morning, USS Albacore had detected Ozawa's flagship Taihō and moved in for the kill. At 8:15 a.m., just as Taihō was launching aircraft for its second strike, Albacore fired a spread of torpedoes. Lookouts on Taihō spotted the white wakes and shouted warnings. The carrier turned sharply as escorts dropped depth charges. In the chaos, a Japanese pilot named Sakio Komatsu, having just taken off, saw an incoming torpedo and deliberately rammed it, detonating it at the cost of his own life. Taihō avoided one fatal hit, but another torpedo slammed into her starboard side, ripping open a gash that allowed aviation fuel to flood the compartments. The ship staggered, but, thanks to its advanced design, managed to continue steaming for several hours. By midday, tragedy struck again. USS Kavala had shadowed the veteran carrier Shōkaku, survivor of Pearl Harbor and many major battles. At 11:23 a.m., while Shōkaku was busy recovering aircraft and refueling, Kavala loosed a spread of torpedoes. At least 3 struck home, setting off massive explosions in the hangar. Fuel and ordnance ignited, creating a fireball that engulfed the bow. The order to abandon ship was given. At 2:08 p.m., a final catastrophic blast tore the carrier apart. Shōkaku broke in two and sank, taking 1,263 sailors and airmen with her. About 570 survivors, including Captain Matsubara Hiroshi, were rescued by escorting ships. Meanwhile, aboard Taihō, her crew worked desperately to contain the damage, sealing bulkheads and flooding compartments with CO2. For hours, it seemed she might survive. But a critical mistake sealed her fate. A damage control officer, lacking experience, ordered the ventilation system run at full power to clear fuel vapors. Instead, it spread volatile gasoline fumes throughout the ship. At 5:32 p.m., a spark from a generator triggered catastrophe. A chain of internal explosions ripped through the vessel, tearing apart elevators and decks. Flames shot hundreds of meters into the sky as Taihō, pride of the Japanese fleet, shook violently and slipped beneath the waves. Admiral Ozawa barely escaped, transferring his flag to a destroyer. The carrier went down with 1,650 of her crew. In a single day, Japan had lost 2 of its most important carriers to submarine attacks. At dawn on June 20th, after a night of disaster, the remnants of Ozawa's force retreated westward, hoping to escape. But the Americans pressed the pursuit. Admiral Spruance ordered his fleet to steam at full speed through the night. By morning, dozens of U.S. scout planes swept the ocean in search of the enemy. On the carrier Zuikaku, the sole survivor of Pearl Harbor still afloat, Ozawa transferred his flag at 1 p.m. That was when he finally learned the full extent of the previous day's failure. All 4 attack waves had been annihilated, and his carrier air groups were down to roughly 150 operational planes. What he did not know, because his subordinates hid the truth, was that nearly all of the land-based aircraft on Guam and Rota had also been destroyed. In ignorance, Ozawa still clung to the idea of mounting another strike on June 21st. By midday on June 20th, the skies were clear, but American scout planes had still not located the enemy. All morning and into the early afternoon, Mitcher grew restless as report after report came in with the same message: no contact. Finally, at 3:40 p.m., a scout from USS Enterprise sighted the Japanese fleet on the horizon and rushed back a vague signal. Mitcher demanded precise coordinates, and at 4:05 p.m., the confirmation arrived. The Japanese were 275 miles to the west, moving at 20 knots. Time was slipping away. The sun would set around 6:30 p.m., leaving less than 2 hours. A decisive order was given across the American carriers: launch all aircraft. It was a dangerous gamble, as the strike would fly at the very edge of their range and almost certainly return after dark. But Mitcher and his commanders recognized this as the moment to deliver the killing blow. The decks shook as nearly the entire Task Force 58 took to the air, 226 planes in total, 95 Hellcats armed with 500-pound bombs, 54 Avenger torpedo bombers, and 77 dive bombers, both Helldivers and Dauntlesses. Wave after wave climbed into the sky and sped westward in pursuit of Ozawa's battered force. At about 6 p.m., while the Japanese fleet was refueling, lookouts suddenly spotted dark shapes approaching from the east. Sirens wailed. Ozawa scrambled his last 35 Zero fighters into the air. The escorts tightened formation, anti-aircraft crews loaded their guns. Minutes later, the roar of American engines filled the sky, and the assault began. The first U.S. squadron stumbled across 3 Japanese oilers trailing behind the main fleet. With fuel running low, some groups struck immediately. Bombs tore into the vulnerable tankers, setting 2 ablaze and breaking another in half. Columns of fire lit the horizon, and Ozawa could only watch in fury as his precious supply ships went up in flames. Then the full weight of the American strike fell on the carriers. On Hiyō, officers barely had time to shout, "Enemy aircraft port side," before torpedoes slammed into the hull. Avengers from USS Belleau Wood had slipped through the defensive screen and scored at least 2 hits. Hiyō shuddered violently, smoke engulfing her decks. Fire spread too quickly to be controlled. Within 2 hours, a massive explosion ripped her apart. The carrier broke in 2 and sank, taking 250 sailors with her, though over 1,000 were rescued by destroyers. Elsewhere, Shōkaku, Junyō, and Chiyoda were also hit. Thick smoke rose from their decks, though most of the bombs detonated close alongside rather than on target, sparing them total destruction. The battleship Haruna was struck on a main turret, killing and wounding many, but quick action to flood the magazines prevented a catastrophic detonation. After half an hour of relentless bombardment, the attack subsided. Japan had lost 3 vital oilers and the carrier Hiyō, while the other carriers were damaged. American losses were about 20 planes. Ozawa stood on Shōkaku's bridge, stunned as black smoke billowed across his shattered fleet. The dream of a decisive battle to turn the tide had collapsed. For the Americans, the mission was not over. Now their aviators had to make it back in the dark after flying nearly 300 miles. At 8:45 p.m., the first returning aircraft appeared. Landing on carriers at night after such a long sortie was nearly impossible. On USS Hornet, Rear Admiral Joseph Clark ordered floodlights switched on to guide the pilots. Mitcher then made the bold choice to illuminate the entire fleet, exposing them to risk, but giving his flyers a chance to land. Searchlights swept the sky. Destroyers fired flares to light the sea, and one by one, exhausted planes came down. Some pilots, out of fuel, crash-landed on the first deck they saw. Others ditched in the ocean or bailed out. Rescue operations continued through the night. By dawn, 80 aircraft had been lost to crashes or fuel exhaustion, but 3/4 of the air crews survived, many plucked from the sea. Mitscher was deeply aware of the cost. This was the price of his gamble at sunset. That same night at Combined Fleet Headquarters in Japan, Admiral Toyota read the final reports. The outcome was undeniable. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had ended in disaster. He ordered Ozawa to withdraw. The U.S. fleet pursued briefly, then halted, having secured its victory and safeguarded the Saipan landings. After 2 days of combat, the Philippine Sea had witnessed the largest carrier battle in history. Japan had launched 373 carrier aircraft in 4 waves. Only 130 returned, many later lost with their ships. Including land-based planes and submarine attacks, Japan's total losses were between 475 and 550 aircraft, virtually its entire elite carrier air arm. Ozawa was left with barely 35 planes. In ships, the toll was equally devastating. 3 fleet carriers, Taihō, Shōkaku, and Hiyō, and 2 oilers destroyed, with the surviving carriers damaged. The Americans, by comparison, suffered negligible losses. No ships sunk, only South Dakota slightly damaged, and 123 planes lost, most to nighttime accidents rather than enemy fire. The result was nothing less than an overwhelming American victory. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, mockingly remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, delivered a mortal blow to the Imperial Japanese Navy. In just 2 days, the core of Japan's elite naval air power was annihilated, along with thousands of veteran pilots and mechanics. After this defeat, Japan would never again be able to assemble a carrier force strong enough to challenge the U.S. Navy in open battle. 4 months later, at the decisive Battle of Leyte Gulf, Ozawa still nominally commanded Japan's carrier force. Yet his carriers had virtually no planes left. They sailed only as decoys, a desperate and tragic ruse to lure the American fleet away from the real fight. Strategically, the victory at the Philippine Sea opened the door for the Allies to seize the Mariana Islands. Soon after, Saipan fell, tearing a fatal breach in Japan's so-called absolute defense line. From the airfields on the Marianas, American B-29 bombers began launching devastating raids, reducing Japanese cities to burning ruins. In every sense, the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944 marked the confirmation of America's absolute naval supremacy in the Pacific, and heralded the inevitable decline of the Imperial Japanese Navy in the Second World War.